Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching, and it's Horus Heresy again, this time with the Death Guard Spartan. So if you watched the channel last week, I did my first Death Guard models in the pre-Heresy scheme with the Contemptor Dreadnoughts, and it's time for the Spartan. I couldn't wait, I was going to do the infantry, but it's onto the biggest and I think best Space Marine vehicle. Spartan's obviously a variant of the Land Raider. It is bigger, carry more troops, and really nice. Now the colour scheme I've done, you'll see if you watched a lot of videos, I never do real clean and crisp paint schemes. I just don't enjoy that style of painting. Now it's not really manky dirty, but it is that kind of sepia washed, slightly faded out dirty scheme which I particularly enjoy, so I'll show you how I did that. There is a fair bit of conversion work gone into this. This is the basic vehicle. If you watched last week's video, you saw I took a lot of castings of Death Guard shoulder pads, made some blue stuff moulds, cast up some Death Guard shoulder pads for some symbols, and I used those on the Dreadnoughts, but I needed something bigger for the Spartan itself. If you watch the channel for a while, you'll know that this is the big Space Marine vehicle I scratch built with some Forge World Rhino doors that I then used on the turret, or the top there. Now the Forge World Rhino doors, one, they weren't available when I started ordering my Death Guard pre-Heresy army, and also they're done for the pattern of Rhino with the circular doors, so not necessarily would be fitting to put on the Spartan with the square doors. So I've obviously already painted this model, but you can do castings from painted models. You lose a little bit of detail, but I think that's fine for the effect I'm going for here. So quickly bashed up a blue stuff mould to then cast up the symbology that I wanted to convert the vehicle with. Always use a mountain of green stuff on my conversions and most of my videos if you've seen that. So just mixed up some green stuff super quickly to get the detail out. Now the reason I've used green stuff on these castings rather than sort of milliput or a more solid material is I need the flexibility to maybe mould this around some parts of the tank, and also you can then keep it nice and thin, nice and pliable to then use in that casting. Obviously you could use whatever you like to cast up. So I wanted to make sure I was converting the vehicle up a little bit. You could just skip these stages of putting the symbology on and just paint it up, and that would be absolutely fine, but I do really enjoy making these little blue stuff molds and putting sort of extra pieces on there. I think it just adds that little bit of level of detail, because again the transfer sheets that Workshop released for Death Guard aren't available, frustratingly, because I did look, and that's what led me into getting some 3D printed shoulder pads to take these small Death Guard symbol castings, which if you watched last week's video you'll see that, and obviously in a future video I will be doing the infantry and see that again. So I've made the blue stuff mould, and I'm not going to go through the massive detail of how to make it. You've sort of seen in the background there what I did, and there is a video that I'll link down below about how you do it. Now the vehicle doors obviously have a seam down the middle because it's meant to be folding open, so all I've done there is just scraped off the seam and made sure that that isn't visible on there, because these doors don't open down the middle. Then it's a simple case of carving out the symbol that I've cast up, because I want it just to be the symbol itself in relief, obviously on the tank. So just carving that down, thinning it out, making sure I'm comfortable with the position. So I've got two of those carved out over the course of a couple of nights. I also cast up that number 14 in the Roman numerals from the front of the Forge World Contemptor Dread, and there's the shoulder symbols there, and these are what I'm going to use to turn this into a bit more of a Death Guard-y vehicle. So sticking these on just with super glue, nothing too fancy. So you've seen there just under the twin las cannons, the Death Guard symbol that I've put on there. Now in terms of weapon fit on this vehicle, I did go for the multi-las cannon fit out. I think that anti-armour stuff's really quite useful and also quite versatile, so I did go for that. I didn't magnetise the weapons because I just want that one hit las cannon punch. So I've stuck all the symbols on, you've seen there, not gone too mad, just either back door I've put the big symbols, and then the shoulder panel or shoulder pad one on the front and the number 14. Now I'm just taking a pin drill here and drilling a couple of holes into the model to represent obviously battle damage and impact, because Death Guard do show the damage to their vehicles until the end of the campaign. I wanted to reflect that. Now I'm then taking a hobby knife and just scoring out above where I've drilled to make it look like the rounds or whatever it is have hit and glanced upwards in the armour. So if you're going to do this side, do it at the top of the dent hole, because that looks a little bit more realistic, or as realistic as you can be in this kind of thing. Then I've gone round and just taken some nicks and cuts off and some little patches to damage it. Now at this stage I didn't like how that 14 looked, because I cut it out in a square and I cut around the symbols, and I just thought it didn't look right. So I decided instead to think I'm not going to start painting, backtrack a little bit, take another one of those castings I've made, and then individually slice out the Roman numerals. Now I did that on the Dreadnought, and I wish I'd done this here. I was trying to save a little bit of time, but I think if I'd have carried on like it was, it would have ruined the model, I think, and not been a good effect. So never be afraid to backtrack your steps. Dig out the clippers and chop off that little green stuff panel that I've glued on, and just tidy it up. Obviously, you're going to super speed here. Getting a pair of clippers and just use a file and tidy up that area to smooth it down. Now you will notice if you look on the paintwork here, there's some bumps and lumps in the paint. That's because I've changed the paint I'm putting through my airbrush to undercoat with, and the black did just put some little lumps and bumps. I didn't mix it right in the airbrush, but I decided to crack on with it because I wanted to see what these bumps and lumps would do to the effect, because I figured this Death Guard looking a bit bashed and battered would actually work quite well. So I didn't sort of stop the spraying process and clean up the spatters. I just left it. You know what, it has left quite a nice effect in a couple of areas. Most of it you can't really see now at the end, so just if you've noticed those spatters. But I've undercoated it black, so black spray, and then a sort of gunmetal colour spray as a basis. Lots and lots of time saved here without having to dry brush all the metal later. First stage, we're going into a brass on all the symbols. Just across the model, I've done it on the symbols, the ends of the las cannons, just some details. Now I didn't do the rivets, so I didn't do the brass rivets at this point because I've done that later on. You'll see when we do that stage. Now we're going into now an off-white colour. You don't want to go straight white if you're going to do the Death Guard colour scheme, because it's a real difficult thing to make dirty and look okay. I think that way. So I've done a rakarth flesh, which is a Citadel base colour, and I'm putting it on very, very roughly. You know, you want to see bits of silver showing through, you want to see bits of damage. You don't want this to be a real crisp and clean paint scheme, especially not if you want it to look like I want it to look. So really you're just sort of slapping it on. What I'm showing here is a second layer. I've done some really, really watered down rakarth flesh, so it's more like a glaze, and I'm just going over some of the flatter areas where I might want a bit more definition. So you're almost giving two tones of the colour on there when you're doing it. Now this sterling mud was kind of a mistake to do at this stage, but I was finishing the whole vehicle off in one night before the ink wash, and I thought I'll put the sterling mud on and then that'll dry while I'm doing the other stages, and then I can ink wash it. And it did work, and you'll see here, but it made it really difficult to actually do these stages. So I would spread this out over a couple of nights if you've got the time to do that, but I was kind of rushing to get it done near the end of the week because I've been away for work a bit, so I did kind of rush this bit. Definitely wouldn't recommend doing that, but I've put sterling mud over the tracks just to make it look, you know, a bit dirty and mucked up. Now taking black and putting that onto the coils, or whatever they're called, on the actual las cannon, just to give a little bit of colour difference. I didn't want this to be garish and lots of different colours all over the model in big patches, but some little pieces of colour variance is quite good. And you can see, obviously on the las cannons there, I've done the brass on the end there, you can see. Now a little bit of red into the missile pod on the top. Nothing too extravagant. I've not then used that red everywhere else, but I've put it into some of the vision slits and like gun sensors, but I don't want to go overboard, like I say, because I want it to be a fairly muted colour scheme. Taking then some blue onto the power cables of the las cannons, and this just ties together the colour scheme with the dreadnoughts that I've already done and with the infantry I'm going to do. So little pops of colour just help it tie it together, whilst leaving overall kind of a dirty, mucky effect. Now the lights, you could just absolutely leave these. You know, you don't need to have any colour in the searchlights, but I wanted it not just to look sort of silver and rusty, so just dropping some yellow into the two searchlights that are on the vehicle there before starting on the Death Guard green. Now the stages I've done this in, you could put those colours on in completely different stages. This is just how I've chose to do it. I've got kind of used to doing the metallic brass colours first because they're easier to cover up with the colours later, rather than if you miss with the brass to then have to redo coloured green. That's just how I've kind of found it. But again, putting the Death Guard green on, not too neat and tidy, again like this session before. Now it's just slathering the whole model in Vallejo sepia game wash. Any wash would do, any dirty brown kind of wash. Avoid the kind of fleshy pinky wash tones because you want it to be mucky, dirty, filthy. Now quite often in my paint schemes at this stage I'll say, oh, you could leave it like this and it'd be fine. However, because that wash has gone over an off-white colour, it does leave it too streaky and too mucky to really leave. So it's about going back over it. Now I'm not going back over with fully kind of thick paint on here or anything. I use a wet palette anyway, so it's always slightly watered down, but this is paint that's been on a wet palette overnight from when we did the base coat. And I've put a little bit more water in it, so you're almost doing a glaze. You can see the amount of time I'm spending on each section. You're almost glazing across the model. You put a little bit of paint on, you're spreading it round because you want to see those textures and colours coming out from underneath it. I will focus in a little bit in a second, a bit closer so you can see. but you're leaving all the wash in all the cracks and crevices around the model. It'll look really, really stark when you're putting it on, because bright paint, obviously the white, really looks stark when it initially goes on. But slowing down and getting a little bit closer here, you can see it's kind of halfway between a glaze and a dry brush. Now that sounds a bit strange because the glaze is very wet, but what I'm doing is I'm very, very lightly putting that glaze across the sections. When you look closely, you know, it's building up very, very small amounts of it, even though it is quite watery. You can see there a blob went on and I've just spread it around the panel. So take your time when going across the model here. You know, you make sure the paint's watered down, make sure you're not putting too much on, because you want all these colours and textures to show through from the glaze. So it's like a weird glazed dry brush hybrid. I know that sounds a very strange thing to say, but that's the method I use to make the model. And not everyone's going to like this style of painting, especially on the white. It's a very unusual kind of sepia washed, faded World War I style effect is what I like to think of it. You're doing the same on the Death Guard green on the doors, exactly the same, coming down and picking detail out whilst remembering to leave some of the shade around there. So you can see on the third lump, as I've gone around there on the right, if that's even the technical term, I've left quite a big bit of that shade coming from that side, because again, that's where the muck would maybe build up or whatever. So you're not covering every last element of this. You want to leave that kind of dirt showing. Now it's down to detail stages, so just going around with the same colours you've already used and just dropping bits of it on there as a bit of a highlight layer up there. You know, sort of dry brushing over the cables here, leaving the wash in the shadows, not covering every last bit of blue you've already put, because again, highlight stage. Now I said before, when I put the brass colour on, that will come back to the rivets later. If you'd have done all these rivets to start with, one bit of a time waster, because all the ink wash would cover them too much, and then when you're doing your next wash stages and everything, you'd cover a lot of the brass over, something I learned on the Dreadnought. So going around and putting that brass on all the rivets. Now I'm not going to go through my technique for doing the sort of muzzle burn effect on the vents there, but I do use a 3 inks. It's a Druchi Violet, it's a Drakenhof Nightshade and a Nuln Oil. Druchi Violet start off and you cover sort of 3/4 of the vent, then the next colour you cover probably half, and then the Nuln Oil you cover the very last piece. So I will do a separate video on that, just as a one effect and a simple 30-second job, but just to speed this video up, we'll just skip past it. Now the colour I'm brushing onto the mud, so onto the sterling mud that we put on there, is just a beastie brown. It's a Vallejo paint. I'll put all the paints in the description down below so you can see it, but that's the colour that I'm using on the bases of my marines, so it'll tie that together. Now it's detailing, so I've gone around and taken some metal and I'm painting some of the metal into all the bullet holes that I've drilled, just to put a little bit more definition, because I've covered some of that exposed steel up. Now we're doing 2 washes. We're doing a rust wash. You saw me there, I dropped it in, put a bit too much on, dried the brush off, and just then took a load off. So, you know, putting a wash on, you can then remove it with a brush that isn't covered. And then using nihilakh oxide on some of the brass rivets, not all across the model. I've left quite a few just with clean brass, but on the detail pieces in terms of the symbology and the number 14 there, and on some of the rivets, just to then finalise that muckying up. So the last part of this painting, I just give it a good layer of varnish, because this is a gaming piece. And that's everything here. So you can see a dirty, mucky kind of paint scheme with a few technical details kind of at the end there, a bit of mud showing on the tracks. And that is my Death Guard Spartan. Hope you liked it. I'm quite happy with the effect. It is a very different effect. You know, it's not for everyone, this paint scheme, I would definitely agree. But I like how it looks, and I think it's going to look nice next to the Dreadnoughts. And then when I start painting the infantry, which I'm going to begin straight away after finishing this video practically. So if you liked all this, you know, keep following the channel, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Check out my Instagram and Facebook, and I'll see you on another video.